Good evening from Cambridge, Massachusetts. Very excited to be here on the day my memoir is published, and I think we'll get right to it. It's called A Synthesizing Mind, and the book is both a description of the theory of intelligence, for which I'm best known, but also a memoir of my own life. And so I'll be interspersing material about MI theory, about the theory of multiple intelligences, with some autobiographical notes. And then I will explain why we're talking about synthesis, because to give you a very brief synopsis of the book, for about 40 years, I've been studying other people's minds and other people's intelligences, but I decided that it was time to study my own, and I discovered I have what's called a synthesizing mind, and I will try to explain that to you today and give you some thoughts about what synthesis is and how we can perhaps nurture it and develop it in the future. I have my eye on the clock, and as we head toward the end of the hour, I will wind down so we have plenty of time for questions and comments. About 40 years ago, I helped to switch a conversation from intelligence singular to intelligence plural. And the study of intelligence in psychology begins with Alfred Binet, who was a French psychologist who lived over a century ago, and he was trying to predict which students would have trouble in school. And he came up with a very important idea that if you gave a series of questions to young people, you could predict who would find school easy and who would find it difficult. And his ideas were brought to the United States by a psychologist named Thurston, and he basically regularized and commodified the Binet instrument so that you could test anybody's intelligence in a relatively short period of time. And you all recognize questions like this reinforces to stronger, and you have to pick one of 5 choices, or a mathematical problem like this, how long does it take Rocky and Fido to walk around the block? And if you do well in questions like this, you'll get a high IQ score, and you'll probably be considered smart. And when you think of intelligence singularly, you think of it like weight or like height. You just step on a scale or you stand by a ruler, and you know how smart you are by asking a set of questions. Indeed, in the West, which includes most of Europe and the United States, the general default belief is there's a single thing called intelligence. It's highly heritable. That means that we know how smart your grandparents were. We can tell how smart you are, and measurement people can give you a test and give you your IQ. Note that if you go out of the West to Asia, who your grandparents were becomes much less important, and how hard you work becomes much more important. Their intellect is seen as a measure of effort and not simply of your grandparents. So about 40 years ago, after I had spent many years studying children and studying brain damage patients, I came to the conclusion that a single notion of intelligence was simplistic, and it didn't really cover the range of human intellect. And so I spent 5 years with a research team reviewing the whole set of different sources of information taken from what we know about Homo sapiens evolution, what we know about the organization of the brain, because I've been doing neurology for many years. I took a look at what we call special populations, individuals who are very strong in one area like a prodigy, or very weak in one area like an individual on the autism spectrum. I looked at the kinds of abilities which are valued in different cultures, historically and contemporaneously, and I looked at all sorts of psychological instruments as well. And I eventually came up with a set of 8 criteria for what is or is not an intelligence. And in a flash of insight, I decided to call these not talents, in which case you probably wouldn't be hearing me today, but calling them the human intelligences. And for better or for worse, that got many people's attention. So here's a definition of intelligence. It's a potential, biological, neurological, as well as psychological, that we have to process certain kinds of information so we can solve problems or make things which are valued in a culture or community. And the image I have is not a single computer, but a whole bunch of different computers, each one of which resonates to a different kind of information in our society. You can see that instead of a single computer and a single brain, I think of a bunch of different computers, which are the multiple intelligences. So in a book called Frames of Mind, I defined initially 7 intelligences. The first one is linguistic, the intelligence of a poet or storyteller. Logical, mathematical, the intelligence of a scientist or mathematician. Shot ahead to musical, let me go back to linguistic and logical are what's tested in an IQ test. So you have a high linguistic and logical intelligence, you'll do well in school. And as soon as you stay in school, as long as you stay in school, you think you're smart. But of course, most of us eventually leave school, and that's where the other intelligences become important. Musical intelligence, spatial intelligence, dealing with large spaces like an astronaut or a pilot, or more local spaces like a chess player. Bodily kinesthetic intelligence, the intelligence of a dancer, an athlete, a surgeon. Interpersonal intelligence, the intelligence of a salesman or an actor or some kind of a politician. Intrapersonal intelligence, this is where you understand yourself well or not so well. And of course, in the modern world where we have to make our own decisions about where to work, what to do, and so on, interpersonal intelligence is very important. And after Frames of Mind, I introduced one more intelligence called the naturalist intelligence, which I often call the intelligence of Darwin, because it's the ability to discriminate between one plant and another, one animal and another, one cloud configuration and another, one rock formation and another. And these are the 8 intelligences. And this, as I said, was a theory which got a lot of attention, caused a lot of argument, particularly in the United States and Britain, where IQ tests were reached their majority, so to speak. But over the years, except for psychometricians who spend their lives measuring IQ, most people think there's a lot of validity in the theory of multiple intelligences. Here's the scientific claims. I know many of you are watching, have a scientific background. All human beings have these intelligences, linguistic, mathematical, musical, spatial, etc. But no 2 humans, not even identical twins, have exactly the same profile, because even if we have the same genes, we don't have the same experiences. And in fact, identical twins often want to distinguish themselves from one another, so they deliberately go into different kinds of vocations and avocations. Let me switch now to tell you about who came up with this theory and why. This is Scranton, Pennsylvania, where 77 years ago, in the town in Pennsylvania called Scranton, I was born. And I wouldn't usually mention this autobiographical fact, except I was born in the same year, in the same city, town, as Joe Biden, who, as you may know, tonight, it's going to be very late for you, will be having a debate with President Trump. I didn't know Biden in Scranton. He only stayed there for about 10 years, but I will have a fellow citizen in the White House if the election goes the way many of us hope it will. So I was born and raised in Scranton. I was the proverbial Jewish boy who hated the sight of blood, so I was destined to become a doctor, a physician. here I am with my sister when I was 11 years of age. My sister and I both live in Boston now, and toward the end of their lives, my parents both moved from Scranton to Boston, so we were all together. Speaking of presidents, this is me in the newspaper when I was a dozen years old, taking a photograph of Adlai Stevenson, who ran unsuccessfully for the presidency in 1956. He was defeated by Eisenhower. This is what I looked like when I was through high school and getting ready for college. I went to college in 1961 in Cambridge, Massachusetts, at Harvard College, and I've been there ever since. So the apartment I mentioned is in Cambridge, where I've lived this is my 60th year, and I've been very fortunate because even though I started out wanting to be a lawyer, I eventually became very interested in science, social science, the humanities, and became a scholar. And for 15 years, I did simple research on children and brain damaged patients. That's where I developed the theory of multiple intelligences. But since then, I've been teaching at the education school at Harvard. And a lot of my work on intelligence has now been used in the area of education. Many schools in Britain and the United States, all over the world, have been influenced by MI theory. Here I am in midlife. There are a lot of intelligences I don't have, but musical is one I do have. I play the piano every day for an hour, and for fun, I also play the accordion, and one time I played the flute. And here I am with my family last year, 4 children all grown up and 5 grandchildren. And to my left, though it looks to you like to my right, is my wife, Ellen, who whenever the technology breaks down is here to help me. I've had a very good life, much more fortunate than many people nowadays during the time of COVID. But like many of you, I'm very, very concerned about what's happening in the world, in Europe, in Asia, and in the Americas. So if you want to know more about Howard Gardner, biosynthesizing mind, but it's interweaved with the development of multiple intelligences theory, and then what I won't talk about this evening, the work I've done in the last 40 years, because I haven't simply rested on MI laurels. I've spent years studying ethics and morality and what we call good work, how people who are workers, as almost all of us are, can do work that's excellent and engaging, but also carried out in an ethical and moral way. One of many reasons why I am very worried about what's happening throughout the world. When I developed the theory, it was kind of a projective test. It was like ink blot. You show people an ink blot, and somebody says it's a mother hugging a son, and somebody else says it's a wife strangling a husband, and somebody else says it looks like the universe to me, and somebody else says it looks like the COVID virus. And of course, it's just an ink blot. So multiple intelligences was a psychological theory, but many people in education developed educational ideas. Some people said, well, if there's 7 or 8 intelligences, we should teach everything in 7 or 8 ways. Some people said we should have 1 course in language, 1 course in music, 1 course in understanding yourself. But after quite a few years, I came up with the conclusion that there are 2 primary educational claims, and I call them individualize and pluralize. And now where in so many countries we have to teach online via computer or some other kinds of computational mechanism, these become very important. Individualize means we should learn as much as we can about every single learner and try as much as possible to teach that child or help that child learn in ways that are comfortable for that child. Until 50 years ago or 100 years ago, this was available only for the very wealthy because they could hire a tutor, and the tutor could individualize. But now, because of technology, chiefly computational, virtual realities, all kinds of games and Khan Academy and so on, we can provide much more individualized education for every child, and that's a tremendous boon. Secondly, we should pluralize. This is, I think, even more important, but perhaps more controversial. I think in education, we should really decide what are the most important things to teach. I think a lot of things that we spend time on now are not that important, but we should decide on what's really important, and then we should try to teach those topics in a number of different ways. So whether it's history, science, mathematics, psychology, literature, painting, we shouldn't just teach it one way, which often becomes verbal or logical. We should teach in a number of ways, artistically, dramatically, making things hands-on, having dialogue, creating models out of Lego. And when we teach things in many ways, we show what it's really like to understand something. Because anything you understand really well, you can explain and depict and enact in lots of different ways. And sorry if this makes any of you nervous, anything that you can only teach in one way, you probably don't understand very well. So we might say in a Howard Gardner School of the Future, the teachers, parents, everybody in that child's world should know as much about that child as possible, individuate education as much as possible, and decide what's really important. Nowadays, I would say it's understanding the environment, understanding the economy, having a relationship to an art form. Teach it in lots of ways. You'll reach more people and you'll have deeper understanding. So much for MI. I'm going to stick talking about minds, but I'm going to talk about it in a somewhat different way. I wrote a book called 5 Minds for the Future, and in that book, I described 5 kinds of minds. You can see them here: disciplined, synthesizing, creating, respectful, and ethical. And when I talk about the minds, of which there are 5, I'm not talking about the intelligences. I'm talking instead as a person who believes in policy, and I'm saying that I think that in a school or in a business or in a home, indeed in any kind of environment, we should try to develop 5 kinds of minds. And here are the 5 kinds of minds. 3 of them are cognitive, and basically that's what I have done as a psychologist throughout my life. And I call those the disciplined mind, which is understanding different subjects like math or history or music or economics, creating, doing something new, something which hasn't done before, and synthesizing, which I'm going to spend the rest of the time on, figuring out how to put things together in ways which are coherent. But in addition to these cognitive ways, I think we also need to value how we relate to other people. And that's the work on good work, which I alluded to earlier. And to me, that has 2 aspects: respecting, how do we relate to people who are close to us, family, friends, people in the neighborhood. But ethical, how do we relate to anybody with whom we have any kind of intersection in life, whether it's a worker, somebody who is a professional, somebody who is delivering goods, somebody who is taking care of the home, somebody who is helping with your taxes. How do you relate to such people in an ethical kind of way? In the book 5 Minds, you can read about how I think each of these kinds of minds should be cultivated, but for the rest of our time, I want to speak with you about synthesizing. Murray Gell-Mann was a Nobel Prize winning physicist. I had the pleasure of knowing Murray. He spent the last years of his life at the Santa Fe Institute, which was a massive synthesizing enterprise. And Gell-Mann quipped in the 21st century, which is our century, the most important mind will be the synthesizing mind. And I took Murray Gell-Mann very seriously because he was a very wise person, we might even say. He had many kinds of smarts, but also because I think he saw that in our time, it's people who can bring together many different kinds of information and make sense of them and convey it to others that is at a special premium. And he helped me to understand the kind of mind that I think I have. Because as I have quipped, I've spent most of my life trying to study other minds, but when I tried to study my own mind, I realized it was a synthesizing kind of mind, and I want to explicate what that has meant to me. So first, I want to give you a bit of an intuition about what synthesis is across the ages. This is a great work of synthesis, the Bible. This is, of course, a visual artistic kind of synthesis, the Sistine Chapel, trying to help us understand how man came to be according to the Bible. Not all synthesis is religious. Aristotle was probably the greatest synthesizer of the classical era, putting all sorts of areas of knowledge together. I mentioned Darwin already as a naturalist intellect, but Darwin was also an incredible synthesizer. He put together information from geology, from farming, from husbandry, from paleology, from travels that people had done all over the world, such as the Galapagos Islands, where he studied finches. And Darwin was a masterful synthesizer as well as a masterful naturalist. How about some synthesizing today? A great classical synthesizer, known to many of you, is Mary Beard, who covers the entire classical waterfront, so to speak. Thomas Piketty, the French economist who studies not only contemporary economics, but goes all the way back into the early financial and monetary records of Europe and of the United States. An American historian, Jill Lepore, who seems to write a book every week on some other topic of American history or American life. And you might want to take a minute to think about people whom you know. I've picked scholars and artists, but whom do you know, whether it's in your workplace or in your family or in the reading that you do or in the writing that you do, who stands out as being a great synthesizer? Gustav Mahler, the Austrian composer, tried in his music, in his symphonies, to capture all of experience. I think of an anecdote. His student, Bruno Walter, came to see him and when he was staying in the Alps, and Walter was admiring the fantastic scenery of water and mountains and sky, and he said, "How wonderful, Gustav." And Gustav said, "Don't worry, it's all captured in my Third Symphony." And indeed, that's how Mahler thought. Wagner was another great artistic synthesizer. Pablo Picasso, one of the great painters of the 20th century. This is his famous painting, Guernica, inspired by bombing during the Spanish Civil War. And this is the final painting, which is now at the Prado in Madrid. But Picasso did over 200 sketches before producing Guernica, and he tried to capture so much of Spanish life, war, peace, bulls, animals, love, death, and so on. Wonderful contemporary American artist, Kara Walker. I'm sure she's at the Tate Gallery, Tate Modern Gallery, and other museums in Britain. Her canvas covers all of American historical life, present, past, Revolutionary era period, slavery, Civil War, contemporary, and so on. So these are people who are synthesizers in the arts. So as I say, I became interested in synthesizing because when I began to examine my own mind, I decided that's what I did, that's what I had. And a interesting formulaic way of describing synthesizing is that it's between journalism on the one hand and experimental hard science on the other. Journalists given an assignment has to be done quickly. They gather all the information they can, and then they publish or broadcast what they've done, and then they move on to the next assignment. There is something called long-form journalism, where people are given a lot of money and a lot of time, and that's closer to what I do, because one of the end products of long-form journalism are books of the sort that I write. In experimental hard science, you have a hypothesis, you collect data in whatever way is appropriate, and the hypothesis is either demonstrated to be true or false, or more likely, it's just more complicated than you thought. And I've done a lot of experimental science in my time. I was a trained psychologist with many experiments, and my students still do. But in synthesis, you may be drawing on huge amounts of data. In a current study, I'm drawing 2,000 interviews, which we carried out. But we're not doing hypothesis testing. We're trying to make sense of what it is that people tell us. And what the synthesizer is trying to do is whatever problem he or she has defined for self is gathering as much data as possible and then trying to organize it in ways which make sense. And paradoxically, if the synthesis makes a lot of sense, it may actually change what the world is like in the future, which is rather different from hard science. When you study a neutron or a neuron, it doesn't change. But if you're doing the kind of human synthesis that I am, and you report something and it convinces people, it may actually change the way that they are. So try to think of the journalist on the one hand and the scientist with a test tube on the other, and that's what the synthesizing mind does, as described in this slide. The synthesizing mind gathers as much information as it can. On the web often, books, articles, videos, YouTube, and especially places like Google or Wikipedia or YouTube. And then this information is largely undigested and it's not evaluated. It's just there, it's the stuff. And we synthesizers go over the stuff over and over again, try to put it together in many different ways. I'll show you some of the ways. And our goal is to finally make a statement in whatever social medium or medium of expression we have. And we present the synthesis to the world, and the world can either say it's great, it stinks, or it's okay, but you need to do some more work on it. And I know the psychology literature quite well. There isn't much in the psychology literature which really helps us understand synthesis, and I think I can tell you why. We psychologists like to create tests and do experiments that can be done quickly so we can publish them and then move on to something else. Synthesizing takes a lot of time. The synthesis I did for frames of mind, multiple intelligences, took 5 years. The synthesis which we've done for our study of higher education, where we did 2,000 interviews, has taken 10 years. And if you want to get tenure, it's very hard to study something that takes 10 years. So we tend to study things which are much crisper, not things which take a long period of time. So to continue with the synthesis continuum, we write, we record, we listen, we sketch. We can produce a competent synthesis, which is what you have when you simply are working in your discipline. That's what a textbook is like. But textbooks can have original twists, and as they move to be more original, they become more interesting syntheses. They move toward creativity. Similarly, if you're thinking about scholarship, doing work in a discipline or an art form, you can either work within a paradigm, or you can break the paradigm, and that turns out to be a more creative kind of synthesis. So what this slide says, and I think it could be clearer, is that any kind of synthesis that you can do can be lousy, competent, or it can be quite creative. And what you want, if you are an artist or a scholar, is a synthesis that goes beyond the humdrum, that's actually rather creative. And those things which are interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary, transdisciplinary are more likely to get high grades for being creative syntheses. So let's say that we shut off the mirror, and I stopped talking about my own synthesizing, which I've tried to create. But how do we help other people to synthesize? Here in a very compact slide is how I think about this issue. First of all, you have to say, what kind of a synthesis do I want to have? Do I want to write something about my family? Do I want to describe to other people the current state of quantum computing or quantum mechanics? Do I want to predict what's going to happen in the next 6 months with COVID? What's the synthesis that I want to produce? Where do I start with? You shouldn't have to start from scratch. There should be earlier syntheses. But then you have to collect information which you think is relevant, but you shouldn't be too judgmental because you're never quite sure what's going to be useful for your synthesis or what's not. And the last part of this compact slide is where I think the heart of the matter is. And that is, you have to figure out what are the ways in which you can scaffold yourself to go from the data, the raw data, such as it is, to having, we might say, synthesis 1.0. Do you make narratives, stories? Do you create taxonomies? Do you write equations? Do you make maps, mental maps? Do you create metaphors, images, systems of systems, meta-narratives? These are all terms of art, but it does capture the different ways in which you as a synthesizer, somebody trying to help yourself or others synthesize, to figure out, how do I keep score about whether I'm moving toward that final synthesis or not? And you have to pick symbols of synthesis, symbol systems of synthesis, which make sense for you. I love to create taxonomies, to make grids and super grids and superimpose them on one another and use Excel sheets and things like that. But that may be for somebody else. You may rather tell stories, have narratives. You may want to write equations. You've got to have a language of synthesizer that makes sense to you. And importantly, you can't say, well, the synthesis is done, I'm going to go on and do something else or make dinner. You've got to test the synthesis out on other people, because it's not enough to be just for you unless you never want to share it. It has to make sense to other people. So if you're doing any kind of a written report or any kind of a speech or any kind of a work of art or work of science or management report, you've got to try the synthesis out on other people and see whether it makes sense to them. And that's what I'm talking about here in this slide. Whether you're doing a term paper or a website or a TED Talk or tweeting something, you need to have a rough draft, test it in other people, finish it just in time. And then if you want to become a master synthesizer, which I have aspired to do long before I ever came up with the term, you just keep doing it until you get better at it. And I've been teaching for, 50 or 60 years. And one of the things I try to do is to help people synthesize, even though I didn't have that term until fairly recently. Here I am, the multiple intelligences person. which intelligences do I use in synthesizing? That was not self-evident to me. I'm an academic, and so I use language, and I use logic and math also. And since I like to create taxonomies and categories, that uses my naturalist intelligence. But also, as I mentioned earlier, I've been quite involved in music, and I taught piano for quite a few years. I actually think my own synthesizing is influenced by my musical intelligence, such as it is, because I love to listen to works of music, particularly classical music, but also jazz and show tunes, and figure out how they're put together. How are they started? How are themes developed? When did they return? How are they put together? And I think my thinking and my writing is musical. Now, it might be quite discordant to you. You might not like my music, but I think I draw on that intelligence quite a bit. I don't draw particularly on my spatial intelligence, which is pretty meager. I guess I've just actually drawn my intrapersonal intelligence now, because in trying to explain to you how I synthesize, I talked about the intelligences which I use. And for any of us who want to perform psychotherapy on ourselves, we need to have a good intrapersonal synthesis, but I certainly wouldn't recommend that for most of us. We're not, you need help. You need a shrink with interpersonal intelligence, so he or she can help you understand yourself. So as we're moving toward the end of the talk and trying to summarize, what I've tried to do here is to say that I think synthesizing is very important for everybody, and particularly in our time. It's not the same as doing a work of journalism, which you finish and then forget. If you do it over a long period of time, you have to use lots of different kinds of frames and metaphors and techniques. You need to test it against yourself and against others. And you should figure out which kinds of intelligences work best for you, because they probably are the ones that will help you to be a good synthesizer. Synthesis can go wrong. It can be too broad. It can be too mired in detail. It can be conceptualized inappropriately. It can be carried out in a sloppy way. It can be not appropriate for a situation. It can be too egotistical. I did it, it's right for me, therefore it's right for you, not paying attention to feedback. You can want it to be creative without having done the homework, or as I just said, it may work for you, but not for anybody else. And as I have been a teacher of synthesizing without knowing it, these are the kinds of things that I've been doing. And it's not that different than what happens in a term paper or in a book report, but it's much more self-conscious now that we've begun to develop a small armamentarium for synthesis. So what about synthesis in our time, in Murray Gell-Mann's time, synthesis in the 21st century? I'm sure many of you are asking, and if not, I will ask you, what about artificial intelligence? Can AI produce better and more apt syntheses than we can as human beings? Maybe just as we can download a lot of our house tasks, a lot of our driving needs, and maybe some of our schoolwork, though we shouldn't, to AI. Maybe we can have AI doing synthesis as well. That will probably come up in the question period. Give you this interesting passage from The Economist from just actually a month ago today. I'll read it to you. Palantir is a company which I just read, initial public offering $22 billion. So you should leave now and make sure your broker buys it for you. Palantir, or Palantir, I'm not sure how to pronounce it, says it sells programs that gather disparate data and organize them into something usable for decision makers, from soldiers in Afghanistan to executives at energy firms. More than a technological project, says The Economist, it's a philosophical, even a political one. Well, clearly people aren't going to buy Palantir stock for its philosophical or political reasons, but that's why I'm interested in, because I'm delighted to have an AI algorithm do synthesis for me. But I'm not going to have that algorithm decide what to synthesize, nor am I going to have it decide what sense to make of the synthesis. So, should it study COVID or the flu or polio or muscular dystrophy? That's a decision which we need to make as citizens, whether through voting or through legislation. And then when it comes up with a certain solution, is that a solution which we should use for, let's say, decision to make for driving, or is that a solution that should be made by human beings, mortals, who can die, by individuals or by groups or by leaders? I really think that's the fundamental question for the 21st century. And so, if I can be a bit whimsical, if you let Howard Gardner decide what problem to look at, and you let Howard Gardner decide what to do after the synthesis has been done, then I'm happy to have a smart machine, a deep learning machine, do the actual poring over data for 5 years. I have no particular desire to do that. I'm happy to find out what I would think, but not what judgments I would make. That I think human beings need to make by ourselves. So I want to thank you very much for your attention. Sorry, of course, I can't be there with you in person. If you want to know about multiple intelligences, there's a website called Multiple Intelligences Oasis. If you want to know about what I've been doing these days, look at howardgardner.com. If you want to know about the work we've been doing in ethics and morality, look at the Good Project. If you want to know more about the book, go to The Synthesizing Mind. That's where it is. So thank you very much. And now we'll change the technology, and I'm eager to hear the questions and comments that Martin is going to convey to me.